In the time before railways carved through the heart of India, when the British Raj was still finding its footing across the subcontinent, there existed a shadow that moved along the dusty roads of central India. They were called many names: thugs, Fonsagars, the deceivers, but they called themselves the children of Kali, devoted servants of the dark goddess of time and transformation. This is their story, told not to glorify violence, but to understand a vanished world where myth and reality intertwined like the sacred threads they carried. The year was 1830, and the Grand Trunk Road stretched like a serpent across the plains, connecting Calcutta to the Northwest Territories. Along this road, in the dry season when travel was easiest, merchants moved their goods, pilgrims sought their temples, and families migrated in search of fortune. Among them walked a band of travelers, perhaps 20 in number, moving with the easy confidence of those who knew the roads well. They wore the simple cotton of common folk, carried modest bundles, and spoke the languages of a dozen regions. To any observer, they were merely wayfarers, joining together for safety on the long journey south. At the head of this group walked Feringhea, a man of middle years with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes held a peculiar depth, as if he could see beyond the immediate horizon to something others could not perceive. He was a jemadar, a leader, though no one would have guessed it from his humble appearance. Beside him walked his lieutenant, Hiram, younger and quicker, always scanning the road ahead and behind. They spoke little as they walked, conserving energy in the afternoon heat, their feet moving in the rhythm of countless miles. "Sahib," Hiram said quietly, using the term of respect. "The merchant's party is 2 days ahead. They've hired guards, 6 men with talwars." Feringhea nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "We have time. Let them grow comfortable with the road. Let them believe the dangerous passes are behind them." This was the art they had perfected over generations, the art of patience, of becoming invisible through familiarity. They would join another group, gain trust through helpfulness and companionship, and share food and stories around the evening fire. They would travel together for days, sometimes weeks, becoming friends, becoming family. And then, when the moment was perfect, when suspicion had dissolved entirely into fellowship, they would strike. Feringhea had not chosen this life. It had chosen him, as it had chosen his father and his father's father, back through 7 generations. In the villages of central India where he was born, there were families who farmed, families who wove, families who worked metal, and there were families who followed the Thuggee. He remembered the night his father had taken him aside, on the eve of his 14th year. They had walked away from the village, into the darkness of the mango grove, where the moonlight filtered through the leaves in silver fragments. "My son," his father had said, "there is something you must know, something you must decide." And there, under the ancient trees, his father had revealed the secret that bound their family, a secret kept for centuries, passed from father to son like a sacred trust. They were devotees of Kali, the goddess of destruction and renewal, and they had been given a terrible task. "The goddess requires tribute," his father explained, his voice steady and calm. "She requires it so that the world may continue, so that time may flow, so that destruction may give way to creation. Without death, there can be no life. Without darkness, there can be no dawn." The young Feringhea had listened, his heart pounding, as his father described the rituals, the signs they watched for, the methods they employed. It was not random violence, his father insisted. It was ceremony, sacred duty. They did not kill for profit, though profit came. They killed because Kali demanded it, because the cosmic balance required it. "You may refuse," his father said finally. "You may choose another path. But if you accept, you will be bound by oaths that cannot be broken. You will be part of something ancient and terrible and holy." Feringhea had not answered that night. He had walked back to the village in silence, his mind churning with questions he could not articulate. But in the weeks that followed, he had watched his father with new eyes, seen the respect he commanded, the way other men looked to him for guidance, the prosperity that came to their household when others struggled. And he had thought about the goddess herself, Kali, with her necklace of skulls and her tongue of blood, dancing on the body of Shiva. Was she not part of the divine pantheon? Was she not worshipped in temples across Bengal? If she was worthy of devotion in one form, why not in another? In the end, he had said yes, and on a night lit by no moon, in a grove far from any village, he had taken the oath and learned to use the rumal, the ceremonial cloth that was both scarf and weapon, both symbol and tool. As Feringhea's band moved south along the road, they encountered other travelers, a family of Brahmins returning from a pilgrimage, a group of soldiers on leave, a pair of British merchants with their Indian servants. Each group they greeted with respect and courtesy, offering to share the road for mutual protection. The British merchants were interested in joining them. One was a young man fresh from England, his face still soft with the innocence of one who had not yet learned India's harsher lessons. His companion was older, more seasoned, with the calculating eyes of one who had made and lost fortunes in this strange land. "Safety in numbers," the older merchant said, extending his hand to Feringhea. These roads can be treacherous, I'm told. Indeed, Sahib, Feringhea replied in careful English, bowing slightly. Very dangerous. Many thugs on these roads. We are humble travelers, but we know the way. We can help. The irony was lost on the merchants, who saw only a useful guide. They joined the band, their bearers adding to the group's numbers. Around the evening fire that night, they shared stories of Calcutta's trading houses and the politics of the company. Feringhea listened with apparent fascination, asking questions that made the merchants feel important, valued. This too was part of the art, making victims feel seen, making them lower their guard through the simple human pleasure of being heard. But in his mind, Feringhea was calculating. Were these men suitable offerings to the goddess? Had the proper signs appeared? There were rules to the hunt, sacred prohibitions that could not be violated. They never killed women, never killed musicians or certain low castes, never killed those who traveled alone or those who had shared salt with them under certain conditions. The theology of Thuggee was complex, built over centuries of tradition. Each kill required interpretation of omens, the call of certain birds, the appearance of animals on the road, dreams that came to the jemadar. Without the proper signs, the act would be murder rather than sacrifice, and would bring the goddess's wrath rather than her blessing. On the third day of travel with the merchants, Hiram came to Feringhea with news. The omens, he said quietly. The blue jay called from the right at dawn, and last night I saw it, the sacred jackal, crossing from east to west. Feringhea felt a chill despite the heat. These were the signs they had been waiting for. The confirmation from Kali herself that the time was right. He nodded slowly. Where is the place? There is a grove ahead, perhaps 2 hours' walk. Dense trees, far from any village. The ground is soft there, easy to work. That evening, as the enlarged party made camp in the grove Hiram had identified, Feringhea felt the familiar mixture of calm and tension that came before the act. Around him, his men moved with practiced casualness, each knowing his role without need for words. The merchants were in good spirits, telling stories of their adventures in India, laughing at their own cultural missteps. The younger one had begun to relax, to see his Indian companions as fully human, to imagine friendships that might transcend the usual barriers of empire and race. This was always the hardest part for Feringhea, not the killing itself, which was quick and required too much concentration for emotion, but the moments before, when he saw the humanity of those marked for Kali. They were not evil men, these merchants. They were not even particularly notable. They were simply men, caught in the cosmic machinery of sacrifice, as all humans were caught, in one way or another. He remembered something his father had told him. We are not cruel. We are instruments. The universe requires death as it requires birth. We simply carry out what must be done. The night was moonless, as tradition required for such work. The camp had settled into sleep, with only the crackling fire and the distant call of night birds breaking the silence. Feringhea lay awake, watching the stars wheel overhead, waiting for the sign. It came at the deepest point of night, the call of the owl, 3 times, from the south. In the darkness he saw Hiram's shadow move, then another, then another. His men were taking their positions. The killing, when it came, was swift. The rumel, yellow silk blessed in rituals and marked with sacred knots, was wrapped around throats in a single, practiced motion. There was no time for victims to cry out, no prolonged struggle. The technique had been perfected over generations to be almost merciful in its efficiency. Within moments it was done. The merchants lay still, their servants beside them. And then began the other work, the careful burial, deep enough that animals would not disturb it, in ground that had been carefully selected for its suitability. Everything the victims had carried was gathered, sorted, eventually to be sold far from this place. The profits shared among the band and their families. But first came the religious observance. Feringhea produced from his bundle a small silver image of Kali, setting it on a cloth before the burial site. The men gathered in a circle, and Feringhea led them in the prayers their families had recited for centuries. Mother of time, destroyer and creator, we offer these lives to you. Accept this sacrifice as our forefathers did before us. Grant us your protection as we walk your dark paths. Keep us hidden from those who would stop your work. Allow us to return to our families and give them prosperity from your gifts. The prayer was in an archaic dialect, words whose full meaning even Feringhea did not completely understand. But the sounds carried power, tradition, the weight of countless repetitions across generations. As dawn approached, the work was complete. The campsite showed no sign of what had occurred. By the time the sun rose, Feringhea's band was miles away, traveling now in smaller groups, their fellowship apparently dissolved by the natural tendency of travelers to take different paths. In Calcutta, in the offices of the East India Company, A young British captain named William Sleeman was becoming obsessed with a pattern of disappearances along India's roads. He was a linguist and a scholar, fascinated by Indian culture, and his investigations had led him to whispered stories of the Thugs, a criminal conspiracy unlike anything known in Europe. The reports seemed almost fantastical. An organization that spanned the entire subcontinent, that operated in secrecy for generations, that killed according to religious ritual, and then vanished without trace. Sleeman's superiors were skeptical. Surely these were exaggerations, local superstitions given too much credence. But Sleeman had assembled evidence, testimony from informants, patterns in missing person reports, the occasional body discovered by chance. He had even captured a few thugs, extracting confessions that revealed the scope and structure of the organization. What fascinated and horrified him in equal measure was the thugs' complete conviction that they were doing holy work. They showed no remorse, no sense of criminality. In their eyes, they were as righteous as any priest performing temple rituals. They believe, Sleeman wrote in his journal late one night, with absolute sincerity, that their goddess commands these acts. They see themselves not as murderers, but as servants of the divine. How does one combat faith itself? He had begun to compile a vocabulary of the thugs' secret language, a specialized jargon called Ramasi, that allowed them to communicate their plans in the hearing of victims without detection. He studied their techniques, their organizational structure, the elaborate system of scouts and diggers and stranglers that made their operations so efficient. And slowly, patiently, he began to build a case, not just against individual thugs, but against the entire system that sustained them. When Feringhea returned to his village, he was welcomed as a successful trader returning from a profitable journey. His wife embraced him. His children ran to greet him. To his neighbors, he was a respectable man, perhaps fortunate in business, but nothing remarkable. The money he brought back, converted into silver and trade goods, was distributed carefully. Some went to his extended family, some to the village temple, some into savings against hard times. He gave generously at festivals, helped neighbors in need, and sponsored marriages for the daughters of poor families. By day, he was a farmer, working his small plot of land like countless other Indian peasants. He attended religious ceremonies at the local temple, dedicated, ironically, to Vishnu the preserver rather than Kali the destroyer. He settled disputes, advised young men, and played with his grandchildren. Only a handful of men in the village knew his other identity, and even fewer understood the complexity of his inner life. The way he held two completely contradictory truths as equally valid. He was a loving father and grandfather. He was a devoted husband. He was a murderer who had killed dozens, perhaps hundreds. He did not see these identities as contradictory. The killing happened in a sacred space, a ritual time outside normal life. When he strangled a man with the rumal, he was not Feringhea the farmer, but Feringhea, the instrument of the goddess, acting in a cosmic drama beyond normal moral categories. Western observers like Sleeman found this psychological compartmentalization almost impossible to comprehend. How could a man be kind to his family and merciless to strangers? How could he see no contradiction between domestic virtue and ritual murder? But in the Hindu worldview that shaped Feringhea's understanding, the contradiction was resolvable. Different contexts required different dharmas, different duties. A warrior's dharma on the battlefield was to kill without mercy. A priest's dharma was to perform sacrifices. A king's dharma was to maintain order through punishment. Each role carried its own moral universe. For Feringhea, the role of thug was simply another sacred duty, as valid in its sphere as any other religious obligation. But the world was changing. The British Raj was consolidating its power, extending its administrative reach into regions that had previously been only nominally under company control. And Captain Sleeman was building his case with methodical determination. In 1830, the same year Feringhea made his journey south, Sleeman was appointed to lead a special campaign against Thuggee. He was given extraordinary powers, the ability to operate across jurisdictional boundaries, to arrest suspects without normal procedures, to try cases under special regulations. He began with informants, offering pardons to thugs who would turn informer and testify against their fellows. It was a brilliant strategy. The thugs' greatest strength, their organization and their secrecy, became a vulnerability once that secrecy was breached. A single informant could identify dozens or hundreds of other thugs across multiple regions. The first major breakthrough came when Sleeman captured a jemadar named Nazir, who, facing execution, chose instead to become an approver, a witness for the prosecution. Nazir's testimony was encyclopedic, revealing details of murders spanning decades, identifying participants, describing methods and meeting places. With Nazir's testimony, Sleeman began arresting thugs across central India. Trials were held in special courts, with approvers testifying to specific murders. The evidence was often circumstantial, a witness identifying an accused man as having been present on a certain road years ago. Another witness describing the disposal of a body. But the cumulative weight was overwhelming. In village after village, men were arrested and transported to trial. Families watched in confusion as fathers and brothers were taken away, accused of crimes that seemed impossible to reconcile with the men they knew. Feringhea heard the news of arrests from traveling merchants. At first it seemed distant, troubles in other regions, not his concern. But as more names reached him, he began to recognize them. Hiram had been captured. 3 other men from his band were in custody. The net was closing. He considered fleeing, taking his family to more remote regions where the company's reach was weaker. But where could he go? The British were everywhere now, their roads and telegraph lines spreading like a spider's web across India. When the soldiers came to his village, Feringhea was working in his field. He saw them from a distance and knew immediately why they had come. He could have run. He knew the local terrain better than any outsider. But something in him chose not to. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was a sense that his time, like all times, must end. Perhaps it was even a kind of relief. The burden of his double life finally resolved into a single, simpler narrative. He let them take him without resistance. As they bound his hands, his wife screamed from their house. His neighbors gathered in confused clusters. To them, this was a violation, an injustice. Feringhea was a good man, a respected man. How could he be what the British claimed? The trial of Feringhea and hundreds of other thugs became one of the major spectacles of the early British Raj. The proceedings were held in courthouses across central India, with British judges presiding over testimony that seemed to describe something from another world entirely. Approvers testified to murders spanning decades. They described specific victims, specific locations, specific methods. They identified the accused men one by one, pointing them out in the crowded courtrooms. This man was the Budote who brought the victims. That man was the strangler. This other man dug the graves. Feringhea sat through his trial with dignified calm. When given the opportunity to speak, he did not deny the accusations. Instead, he tried to explain what the British seemed unable to understand. "We are not criminals," he said through an interpreter. "We are devotees of the goddess. We follow the path our fathers followed, and their fathers before them. The goddess Kali requires sacrifice, and we provide it. This is our dharma, our sacred duty." The British judge, hearing this through translation, could only shake his head. Dharma does not permit murder. No god commands such things. But Feringhea smiled slightly. "You worship a god who demanded his own son be sacrificed on a cross. You eat the body and drink the blood of your god in your rituals. Who are you to judge what the divine requires?" The comparison was too much for the British officials, who saw only blasphemy rather than genuine theological argument. The trial continued with grim efficiency. In the end, Feringhea received a sentence of life imprisonment rather than execution. Sleeman had convinced the authorities that live thugs were more valuable than dead ones. They could provide intelligence, help identify others, serve as witnesses in future trials. Feringhea was transported to a special prison in central India, along with hundreds of other convicted thugs. There, in a strange twilight existence, he lived out his remaining years, teaching the British everything he knew about Thuggee. He was not a broken man. He saw his cooperation as a form of wisdom. The goddess's time had passed, and new powers ruled India. To resist would be pointless. Better to preserve the knowledge, even if the practice itself could not continue. He taught Sleeman the elaborate hand signals thugs used to communicate silently. He described the religious ceremonies, the interpretation of omens, the training of new initiates. He provided names and locations, helping to map the entire network of Thuggee across India. And in his own mind, he reconciled his cooperation with his faith. Kali was the goddess of time and change. Perhaps this ending, the dissolution of the thugs, the triumph of British law, was itself part of her design. After all, she was the destroyer as well as the creator. Perhaps she was simply destroying one of her own creations, moving the cosmic wheel forward to its next phase. Sleeman visited him often, fascinated by this intelligent, articulate man who could describe murder with the calm detachment of a craftsman discussing his trade. Their conversations ranged widely, across religion, philosophy, the nature of duty and sin. "Do you regret it?" Sleeman asked once. "Do you feel remorse for the lives you took?" Feringhea considered the question carefully. "I regret that my sons will not follow my path. I regret that the goddess will no longer receive her tribute in the old way. But regret for the acts themselves? No. I was doing what was required of me. How can there be regret in fulfilling one's dharma?" By the mid-1830s, Thuggee as an organized practice had been effectively destroyed. Sleeman's campaign had arrested or transported thousands of thugs. The elaborate network of families and villages that had sustained the practice for generations was broken. The British declared it a great triumph of civilization over barbarism, of rational law over superstitious violence. In their telling, it was a story of enlightened Europeans bringing order to a chaotic, savage land. But the reality was more complex. The end of Thuggee was not simply the defeat of criminals by law. It was the collision of two entirely different worldviews, two incompatible understandings of what the sacred required. For men like Feringhea, the British victory was not a moral triumph, but simply a transfer of power. The strong had defeated the weak, as had happened countless times in India's long history. The Mughals had come and conquered. The Marathas had risen and fallen. Now the British held power, and they imposed their understanding of right and wrong. But in villages across central India, in families that had once produced thugs, the memory remained. Grandmothers told grandchildren stories of ancestors who had walked with Kali. Young men learned that their great-grandfathers had been something more than simple farmers. had participated in mysteries that the British could suppress but never fully understand. The practice was gone, but the theological questions remained. What does the divine require of us? How do we reconcile duty with compassion, faith with doubt? These questions outlived the thugs themselves. Feringhea died in prison in the 1850s, an old man in a world that had moved on from everything he once knew. The British Raj was now fully established. Railroads were crisscrossing India, and the events of his youth seemed to belong to a distant, almost mythical past. But his story, and the story of the thugs, became part of the folklore of colonial India. British authors wrote sensational accounts of Thuggee, often exaggerating or distorting the facts for dramatic effect. The thugs became, in Western imagination, emblematic of India's otherness, its dangerous mystery. For Indians, the memory was more ambiguous. The thugs were criminals, certainly, but they were also symbols of resistance to foreign rule, practitioners of ancient traditions that predated the British by centuries. In some tellings, they became almost romantic figures, rebels against authority, devotees of a goddess too powerful and too dark for conventional society. The goddess Kali herself survived, of course. She is still worshipped today across India, her temples crowded with devotees seeking her blessings. But the particular interpretation of her cult that produced the thugs is gone, remembered now only in historical accounts and anthropological studies. What remains is a haunting question. How could intelligent, loving people participate in systematic murder and see it as sacred duty? The answer speaks to something fundamental about human nature. Our capacity to hold contradictory truths, to find meaning in violence, to sanctify what others see as evil. The thugs believed they were serving the divine. They were wrong by any modern moral standard. But understanding why they believed it, understanding the worldview that made such belief possible, requires us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about faith, culture, and the malleability of moral conviction. As you drift toward sleep, consider the dark roads of 19th century India. Picture the merchants and travelers moving through that landscape, unknowing of the dangers that walked beside them. Imagine Feringhea, a man of intelligence and conviction, believing with absolute certainty that he was doing holy work. The story of the thugs reminds us that the boundary between civilization and barbarism is not as clear as we might wish. Every culture believes itself moral. Every faith claims divine sanction. The British who suppressed the thugs were themselves presiding over an empire built on violence and exploitation. And yet, we cannot simply embrace moral relativism. Some acts are wrong, regardless of the sincerity of those who commit them. Murder is murder, even when dressed in religious ritual. The challenge is to condemn the act while understanding the human beings who performed it, to hold complexity without losing moral clarity. As you descend into sleep, let these images fade. The dusty roads of central India, the whispered prayers to a dark goddess, the moment when fellowship revealed itself as lethal deception. Let them become dreams, fragments of a vanished world that still has something to teach us about the shadows we all carry. The children of Kali are gone now. Their sacred groves return to wilderness, their secret language forgotten. But the questions they embodied remain. What do we owe the divine? What do we owe each other? How do we live with the darkness within ourselves? Let these questions drift through your mind as consciousness fades. Let them dissolve into sleep, into dreams, into the dark waters where all human stories eventually flow.
भद्रकाली कपालिनी दुर्गा श्यामा शिवा धात्री स्वाहा स्वदाहा नमोस्तुते माँ काली माँ कालिनी ओम शांति शांति शांति